Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we use descriptions from the past to bring historical figures to life. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, was different from Henry's other wives in almost every way. Not only in manners and temperament, but also because she was the only woman to save Henry from his deepest insecurity. The son she would give Henry would be his only male child to outlive him and become King of England, but Edward VI's life would be far from easy. We'll talk about the lives of Jane Seymour and her son Edward, and then reveal our recreations of their appearances at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. To understand Jane's story, we must first talk about the man who would become her husband. King Henry VIII is of course one of the most infamous monarchs in English history. But in the early 1500s, the legitimacy of his reign was still somewhat uncertain. The Tudor dynasty had begun just 6 years before Henry's birth, when his father, Henry VII, defeated Richard III and ended the long and bloody Wars of the Roses. As a somewhat unexpected victor, Henry VII would be crowned King of England, but rebellions would keep him unsettled for the rest of his life. When Henry VII died in 1509, the crown of England and the future of the Tudor dynasty passed to his son, Henry VIII. Because the Tudor line was so short-lived, a male heir was essential to gain the confidence of the people and the nobility. So, England would forge a powerful alliance with Spain. Henry would marry Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, in 1509. Although Henry and Catherine are said to have been a happy couple, they would endure hardship after hardship throughout their marriage. Catherine's pregnancies are said to have been particularly hard on her. Her first pregnancy wouldn't make it to term, but her second did, and gave them a baby boy, who they would name Henry. But their joy would only last 52 days. Their infant son sadly passed away, devastating Henry and Catherine. Though they would try again and again, 5 out of 6 of Catherine's pregnancies would end tragically. Finally, in 1516, they would have a healthy child, a girl named Mary. She would be loved, but she was a disappointment to Henry all the same. A woman had never ruled England, and many people would fight for it to remain that way. After 15 years of trying and failing, Henry and Catherine's marriage was crumbling under the pressure of an absent heir, and by the 1520s, it was clear that the two would not have another child. But this didn't change the fact that Henry needed this heir. Henry would begin to distance himself from his wife, and by the end of the 1520s, he had fallen in love with another, younger woman, Anne Boleyn. He would divorce Catherine and marry Anne in 1533, breaking Catherine's heart and disinheriting his only daughter, Mary. But even after all this effort, Anne would also struggle just as hard to give Henry the heir he wanted. Although she would become pregnant 3 times over 3 years, they would all end with disappointment, with only another daughter named Elizabeth surviving infancy. By 1535, Henry's anxiety over the matter must have been all-consuming. He absolutely had to have a male heir, no matter what he had to do. Henry VIII's psyche is marked by paranoia. It was said he slept in a different bed every night, tossing and turning. In late 1535, Anne became pregnant for the 4th time. But even with the good news, Henry and Anne were fighting constantly. The Queen would realize that this pregnancy was her last chance. Throughout the pregnancy, all of the royal doctors agreed that she was having a boy, giving her some confidence to hold on to. But in early 1536, King Henry VIII, who had always been a handsome, athletic man, was seriously injured in a jousting accident. Not only had he fallen from his horse, but the fully armored horse had toppled him, crushing him under the immense weight. His doctors believed that the injury would be fatal. When news reached Queen Anne, it sent her into shock. The whole realm could now be thrown into another civil war. The whispers of ambitious men began to fill the court as the news of Henry's injury began to spread. But Henry would miraculously wake up after being unconscious for 2 full hours. Although his leg was seriously injured, he was talking, and it appeared that he would make a full recovery. Although he seemed fine, Scholars now believe that the accident may have been the cause of a serious change in Henry's future behavior. Whether it was the physical accident or a sudden realization of his mortality, King Henry began to spend more and more time away from his wife. One day, Anne would walk in to see Henry with a woman sitting on his lap. She recognized her immediately. Her name was Jane Seymour. Jane had been a maid of honor to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and had watched the grief that Anne had caused Catherine. She could not have been more different than Anne. Where Anne was witty, cultured, confident, and hot-tempered, Jane was said to have been calm, gentle, and empathetic. Their obvious difference was seen as an insult to Anne, almost like her faults were the sole cause of Henry's problems. Although misdirected, Anne's anger towards Jane grew stronger by the day. She began to lash out at the people close to her as her famous temper began to go off for nearly anything that inconvenienced her. It became clear that the stress of it all, Henry's accident, Jane, and the unrelenting pressure to deliver Henry an heir had finally made Anne reach her breaking point. In late January of 1536, Anne would suffer a miscarriage. The king and his advisors would soon devise a plan to get rid of Anne. In late April 1536, the queen was accused of having adulterous affairs with 5 men at court, including her own brother. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19, 1536. Just one day later, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour, and they were married on May 30th. For the Tudor court, Jane was a rather puzzling candidate for Henry to choose as the next queen. Although her family was long established in the English nobility, their wealth and influence had diminished in recent years. As for her looks, Jane herself was described as rather plain, with Ambassador Eustace Chapuis saying that she was of middling stature and no great beauty. We know very little of Jane's early life, besides the fact that she was born at Wolfhall sometime between 1504 and 1509, and was raised on the fringes of the Tudor court. But unlike previous queens, her education was primarily in running a household and embroidery. In fact, she could barely read or write. So she was not as brave or intelligent as Catherine of Aragon, nor as witty as Anne Boleyn. So what was it the king saw in her? Most scholars believe that it was in fact these differences from her predecessors that attracted the king to her. Some historians even believe that Jane was more cunning and adaptable than history has given her credit for, even suggesting that Jane purposely cultivated this personality to attract the king. Now, so much of Jane's life has been lost that we may never know for sure, but we do know of her outward actions. Where Anne had celebrated the death of Queen Catherine, Jane is said to have shown sympathy for Anne after her death. This sympathy and compassion also extended to the children of Catherine and Anne, with Jane becoming especially close to Mary, Henry's daughter with Catherine. When Henry annulled his marriage to Catherine, he had also annulled any rights that extended to their daughter Mary. And as a result, Mary spitefully refused to recognize Anne Boleyn as queen, causing her relationship with her father to completely deteriorate. But now that Jane was queen, Jane actively urged Henry to reconcile with his daughter, and perhaps even restore her rights. It was things like this that may have really attracted Henry to Jane. After years of drama and struggle, he may have been ready for a quieter life. Jane became pregnant in early 1537, and on October 12th of that year, after nearly 50 hours of labor, she gave birth. Their first child was born, and the baby was a boy. Throughout England, the news of a son was greeted with joy and relief, and for Henry, all of his prayers had finally been answered. He could breathe easily, perhaps for the first time in his life, with the succession resolved. Even after her incredibly long labor, Jane immediately started writing personal letters, announcing and celebrating the birth of her son, only resting when she was done. The little boy, Edward, was christened on October 15, 1537, with both Mary and Elizabeth involved in their little brother's baptism. It was only after Edward's christening that Queen Jane began to feel ill, and her condition grew worse and worse. She was suffering from what the Tudors called childbed fever. It's what we now call postpartum complications, maybe an infection. Just 9 days later, on October 24th, 1537, Jane Seymour died. Her death hit Henry hard. Although he now had the son he always wanted, a price had once again been paid for his joy. Henry would seclude himself in bed for nearly a week and wore black for months and months after her death. Henry's sadness would lead him to comfort eat, which, along with his recurring wound, caused him to begin gaining a massive amount of weight. His grief would continue on for nearly a year until Henry was finally seen smiling with his long-awaited son. He could often be seen dallying with him in his arms, and he showed him off to anyone that was around, calling Edward this whole realm's most precious jewel. As Edward got older, he would be given his own household and raised by a caretaker. Still, Henry was understandably protective over his only son, demanding extremely high standards for the security and cleanliness around Edward. By order of the king, the prince's rooms were scrubbed from floor to ceiling every day, and everything the prince touched had to be washed first. When Edward was 6 years old, he began the intensive, intimidating education that was fit for a future king, which included the study of humanist philosophy, mathematics, and geometry, and 3 languages, French, Spanish, and Italian. But according to his teachers, Edward actually enjoyed his schooling, and his quick grasp of the concepts he was being taught suggested to them that he would become a very intelligent man. Henry's children were growing up to have a surprisingly close relationship, and although he had grown up with Elizabeth, it was his elder sister Mary who would end up becoming Edward's favorite. In a letter to his half-sister, he sweetly wrote that he loved her most. The 3 siblings would spend Christmases together with their father, Henry, and just like Jane Seymour had wanted, he had restored his daughters to their place in his succession. But these idyllic moments didn't last. By the end of the 1540s, Henry's health had deteriorated. His leg wound from the jousting accident had been re-aggravated time and time again over the years, causing him great pain, and he continued to drink and eat like he had when he was younger. Eventually, he weighed nearly 400 pounds. By January of 1547, King Henry VIII was dead. 9-year-old Edward would be woken up and taken to his sister Elizabeth. They would be told of their father's death together, and side by side, they read Henry's will. The will named 16 men to act as a council and rule until Edward reached the age of 18. All 16 men were supposed to rule equally, collectively, and by majority decision. But, as things always go, ambitious men can't help themselves, and under a last-minute change to Henry's will, the executors were given the power to freely distribute land to themselves and to the court. Soon, the king's uncle, Edward Seymour, was making deals with some of the most powerful men in England. And within days of Henry's death, Edward VI's council unanimously agreed to give the king's uncle near absolute power over England. But even with the full trust of his 9-year-old nephew and the entire council behind him, Seymour would rule for only the next 2 years. Family infighting, rebellions in England, and a costly war with Scotland would cause Edward Seymour to lose nearly all of his influence. In late 1549, Edward Seymour was warned that the council were going to arrest him. He immediately fled London, but not before forcing King Edward to come with him. After days bunkered inside Windsor Castle, an 11-year-old King Edward would write, "Methinks I am in prison." Edward Seymour would eventually be arrested and replaced on the council with John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick. After Seymour's fall from grace, Dudley would take a more passive role than Seymour did, and allow the young king, who was quickly becoming a man, to gain experience in the world of politics that would become his life's work. Edward would begin having weekly meetings with the council, where he would listen to the council debate the things of most importance. Now, historians have argued whether or not Edward was actually involved in the decision-making process here, with some believing that these meetings were done for nothing more than to appease the young king, while others believed that Edward had matured beyond his years, becoming an iron-willed and intelligent king. He was the son of King Henry VIII after all. We can see this side of Edward from different accounts from his own time, and most importantly, when it came to religion. As England's first Protestant king, Edward is said to have been a passionately religious man. He grew very close to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who would become the father figure in his life, calling the king "my dearest son in Christ." As he grew older, Edward's faith only grew more and more important to him. He would begin spending several hours a day in private devotion, and made it his mission to make England a Protestant country. He would ban a number of old Catholic rituals, such as the use of rosaries, the casting of the holy water, the undertaking of pilgrimage, and he would change the language of religion from Latin to English. This, along with other changes, showed how willing the young king was to openly rebel against Rome for his faith. But this open rebellion was also against someone who was much closer to home for Edward. By 1552, his favorite eldest sister, Mary, who he had once told he loved the most, was his enemy. England was poised for a Protestant revolution under King Edward VI's rule. Unfortunately for Edward, fate would have other plans. In April of 1552, he contracted measles, and although he would recover, his immune system was fatally weakened. By that winter, King Edward fell ill once again, only this time it was far more serious. He would battle a never-ending hacking cough, getting better and then relapsing multiple times, before the doctors realized that the illness was most likely fatal. Edward soon realized this himself. Not wanting his Catholic sister Mary to take the throne after him, he would devise his own plan for the succession. He would deny his own sisters, calling them bastards, and instead chose his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, to be the queen after his death. By June of 1553, the king's health had deteriorated so much that he no longer had the energy to walk. "I am glad to die," he would whisper to his tutor, John Cheek. On the 6th of July, 1553, King Edward VI died, at only the age of 15. His successor, the Protestant Lady Jane Grey, was shocked to be chosen for the crown, and within 9 days, Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, gained support and would lead an uprising to overthrow Jane. Mary, Henry's very first child, would become the first Queen of England after all. The story of Jane Seymour and Edward VI is one of Henry's anxiety and control. King Henry would become infamous for his failed attempts to have an heir, but would die thinking that his beloved Jane had finally solved his ultimate issue. Unfortunately, Edward, without a father, would fall prey to the will of ambitious men, turning him against the only family he had left. But, like his father, he too would fail in stopping them from ruling. Ultimately, Edward VI would reign for only 6 years, and his sister Mary I would reign for only 5. After all of the power struggles and the infighting, the rise and fall of ambitious men, it would be the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth, that would gloriously reign over England for 45 years. In the ultimate irony, Henry's need for a male heir would cause him to neglect Elizabeth. Henry's treatment of her mother, Anne, and Edward's betrayal at the end would cause her to have a deep and lasting distrust of men for the rest of her life. In 1603, Elizabeth would die, unmarried with no children, ending the Tudor dynasty forever. So, let's talk about what Jane and Edward really looked like and then reveal the recreations. As we mentioned throughout the story, Henry's choice of Jane Seymour as his next queen puzzled the court. One reason for this is that Jane was quite plain, even for the standards of the time. She was 27 when she married the king, old by Tudor standards, with very fair skin, dark blue or gray eyes, and was a medium height. It's believed that she had blonde hair, but we actually don't know this for sure. Every single portrait of her shows her hair completely covered. Ambassador Chapuis wrote that she was of no great beauty, and Sir John Russell remarked that she needed a lot of adornment, like fine fabrics and jewelry, to shine, whereas her predecessor Anne Boleyn needed very little. Her unassuming appearance and demeanor helped her greatly in her marriage to the king. In terms of portraiture, we have a stunning life portrait of Jane by Hans Holbein, and very little else. Her time as queen was so short that there simply wasn't time to make multiple portraits. This detailed image shows her clothing beautifully. Apparently, Jane had an enormous wardrobe. She especially loved embroidery. We can see her sleeves beautifully embroidered in the style called blackwork, originally introduced to England by Catherine of Aragon. Jane would also wear only the gable hood, this style of headdress, which is frankly not very flattering. However, this was more of a political statement than a fashion one. It was meant to be a departure from Anne Boleyn and her love of the admittedly prettier French hood. Despite being quite young when he died, we have a lot of portraits of the young Edward. We can sense his importance from a young age as the only male heir of the king. Even though Edward is young in these famous portraits, just 10 and 13 in these versions, great effort has been made for him to look mature. His expensive outfit with really wide shoulders is part of this effort. We know Edward has the red gold hair famous in the Tudor dynasty, and the same dark blue eyes as his mother Jane. I'm using this famous portrait by William Scrots to bring Edward to life. So, let's take a look at my recreations of Jane Seymour and King Edward VI now. I also wanted to make an aged-up version of Edward, so we could see what he would have looked like had he lived longer as the King of England. As he ages, we can see more resemblance to his Seymour side, his uncles Thomas and Edward, and of course some resemblance to Henry VIII. Now, let's imagine Edward and Jane in the modern day.